Good evening. Today was a very interesting day, another interesting day. And I kind of figured this when we had the election night here in the United States that with Donald Trump being president again, that this would be a very interesting, will be a very interesting 4 years with a lot of changes and shifts and stuff like that. In of what we had known so far, the status quo is changing left, right, and center. And in Europe, this is starting to take now shape too, not just in Germany. When we're looking at France, the Macron trying to establish a government over there has been also riddled with all sorts of issues, and then the ongoing war in the Ukraine, which I have not commented on in quite a while here. And today is the third anniversary, unfortunately, of the invasion of the Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And now Trump has brought a new twist to this whole thing. And today in the United Nations, Trump, or not Trump, but the United States voted alongside Russia and North Korea and a few other countries on a resolution condemning basically the war without blaming the Russian Federation for the invasion. And that's okay, we just leave it by that for the moment. The more interesting point, which I'm trying to explain to the interested viewer tonight, is the fact that Europe now finds itself in a position where they may have to provide security forces as a peacekeeping mission once a ceasefire comes into effect, hopefully soon, in the Ukraine. And that Macron, the French president, already had indicated that this would happen only without France unless the United States gives or involves itself into this sort of peacekeeping force there, in one way, form, shape, or the other. And for some viewers, it might be interesting to know the history about this, of why we got the situation here. And we have to remember that it was the UK who gave us that option or the idea to this peacekeeping mission there in the Ukraine with European forces, probably some form of Germans and other NATO members, but not as a NATO unit under the command of the United States, the NATO command. Now, in Europe, we have only two countries which have nuclear weapons, and that is the United Kingdom within NATO. That means that UK warheads, nuclear warheads, could be used by other NATO partners on their aircraft or on missiles, for instance. They could be installed, but they're under the care, custody, and control of the United Kingdom. The same goes for the American nuclear weapons, which are in Europe. And the third country itself, the only country on the continent of Europe, is France. And France has excluded their nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons in general to be included in NATO alliance cases. Article 4. Therefore, France has a very unique position. And the reason why they did this, France came fairly late into the game of nuclear weapons It was in the very late 50s and then throughout the 60s that this program was established. And it was during the time when the United States was involved in the Vietnam War, and France was somewhat reluctant. That was especially the time around Lyndon B. Johnson was president here in the United States, that they did not think that there was enough assurance that in a case that, say, like, because of the setup of NATO, I probably need to explain this, that the other NATO member countries, which do not have their own nuclear warheads, can carry on their military equipment American nuclear warheads or British nuclear warheads. That would be in a defense scenario against the former Warsaw Pact alliance in that case. So German aircraft fighters and some German ballistic missiles we had were able to be equipped with American warheads, nuclear warheads, and they could have been launched. That was too much to swallow for France in the 1960s, and probably even is today, that their main adversary in three wars, the 1870-71, the 1914-18 war, World War I, and then in World War II, that this nation, in this case Germany, would be able to be equipped with French warheads, nuclear warheads, which probably won't happen, but it could be a scenario where the fighter pilot turns against him and if he's flying into France instead of over into the Warsaw Pact territory and drops their own nuclear weapon on Paris, just as an extreme example. So this is why France, when it got its nuclear program fully going, decided that they would not allow other NATO members to have use of their weapons. And that leaves France in the entire scenario, in a very separate category of country than the rest of Europe. Let's just say we get only a peacekeeping mission there with French military involvement in an overall European force. Then France, technically, is the only country who has nuclear weapons, which they don't give out to other countries, and they could defend themselves against a nuclear attack by a counterattack against Russia in this particular case. So this is why Macron said no, because he would not send a nuclear weapon, say, like if it comes to a breach of the truth or the ceasefire, and we have now, for instance, Polish troops engaging with Russian troops on a battlefield. If it comes to this, if this would be a worst case scenario, then in this particular instance, the Russian Federation, Putin, could launch a nuclear attack on Poland if they see that this is Polish troops who are there fighting and they could do this. If it happened to be French troops, they would think twice about using a nuclear force against France in this case because of the counterstrike from the French in case of a nuclear attack. So there's a very, very big imbalance in this entire picture. So this is why Macron said the only way France is going to get involved is if the United States gives them security guarantees, meaning that if any one of those peacekeeping nations involved then in the Ukraine in the case that they get attacked, that they would be most likely be defended or protected, like in NATO, under the US nuclear program in Europe. It would be similar to a NATO Article 4 kind of defense situation which would arise out of this, without NATO being directly involved. This is a pretty horrific scenario to think about it, but this is the point where we are, and this is why all of this is very, very difficult to deal with and to sort out. Of course, President Trump is not interested in this because he doesn't want to get involved with Russia in a nuclear war. We have avoided that for over 80 years now, and we're probably not going to start something like this, or they, here in the United States, the leading Republicans at least don't think that this would be a good idea to get involved into something like this. This puts us now back into a position where Europe has to come together. And we know that the first talks, when they met last week with Macron, after Trump had announced his telephone call to Putin, and that they were in talks, and the immediate action was the summit in Paris, where everyone showed up more or less, and the G7 meeting they had today, but primarily last week, with exactly covering this topic. How could a European defense force, to begin with, where only one country really has nuclear weapons, which they don't want to extend their nuclear umbrella to everyone in Europe. That is the French position in this, for the aforementioned reason, is they probably going to be scared that the Spaniards, or the Portuguese, or the Germans may use them against them. It is probably unfounded, but looking historically at the entire situation of Central Europe and the wars we had among each other for several hundred years, will lead to this conclusion that this is probably not a good idea. So how do you build a European defense force where only one country has nuclear weapons? What would be the next logical step? That Poland gets nuclear weapons, Germany gets nuclear weapons, every NATO or every European country gets nuclear warheads on their own. And then if you have a problem, say like again between France and Germany, then you have a nuclear war between these two countries. I mean, it's most likely not going to happen. But these are all worst case scenarios which I'm pointing out here, which makes the situation so difficult. And that was the reason of the involvement of the United States in Europe since the end of World War II, since May of 1945, and their leadership role, which Trump is now going away from. And this has opened up a can of worms, and the winner in this, even though we don't like it, is Putin, because he understands the riddle involved in this. The Russians understand this, of what the European nations have to agree on now in order to actually get this whole situation stabilized in various different aspects. The Ukraine, or the peacekeeping unit in the Ukraine, is only one example of this. A European-style NATO would be very difficult to implement if the French would not go along with sharing their umbrella, their nuclear umbrella, to provide the protection the United States is right now providing. How far the UK is going to be willing to bring in their nuclear arsenal, because we're dealing here with Russia primarily, who is still an extreme powerful nuclear country in terms of amount of warheads and the kilotonnages of nuclear destruction when we're looking at this, versus of what France really has and what the UK has, that is a few hundred warheads with a small quantity in terms of kilotonnage of destruction versus the Russian adversaries. And Macron pointed this out today in his news conference with Trump. Before lunch, they had two, one where they sat down in the White House, and the other one was a regular press conference. The more informal thing he pointed out is that their predecessors, in this case in Germany, it was Merkel, I forgot now who it was in France, I think Hollande, I'm not sure, don't name me down on this, and then here in the United States it was Obama, had done the two peace accords with the Russians, which were then violated in 2014 when Putin actually took Crimea. So this is probably one of the most difficult times Europe primarily has probably seen or witnessed since the end of World War II, since May of 1945. And this will take a lot of foresight and well thought out analytical evaluation of this entire situation here, what we have to deal with from all sides. They have to be very wise and very smart here to come to the correct conclusions. I can tell you one thing, as I'm personally glad that I don't have to decide any of the stuff politically, and of course we know that a lot of the European countries are more pacifists now than they ever were before, which is good all across Europe for the better part, and very anti-nuclear weapons in the first place. On the other hand, is we have to remind ourselves that we're dealing with the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation is still in possession of thousands of nuclear warheads. And they have reduced some of it, but they still have a fast arsenal, the same as the United States, and to a lesser extent China or India. And Pakistan in itself has only very small amounts compared to this. But on the overall thing is, this is still a superpower, an absolute superpower when we deal with Russia if it comes to nuclear arms and the availability for it. Now, the Russians have never used it. We hope they never will. But we have to be very cautious on how we approach this. This is not a decision which should be formed lightly. The other hand, of course, is we would like to help the people in the Ukraine and to stabilize the situation, hopefully with the ceasefire. And then we can figure this out, that this thing is not going to go up, up in smoke here, because that is going to be a lot of smoke which could come out of this. This was just some thoughts today of what we're up against. We're looking at the United States under Trump, who is trying to distance himself from this thing because he understands that Europe is like sitting not just on a stick of dynamite, but this could go up in a lot of ways. And the interesting thing is this, I've been, like I said before, is I read many newspapers in Europe and here in the United States too, is that no one has actually pointed this out as directly and as open as I have mentioned this here, with the possibility or the underlying deeper issues being nuclear weapons, and especially with the Russians being a superpower, because everyone has talked Russia down, but in the end, when you look at this, they still have thousands of nuclear warheads and capabilities to launch them. I hope we will find a good solution to all of this stuff, which we should. We're good people and we're smart people, and we probably can use reason and foresight so we can actually avoid any type of future conflict which could escalate to something much bigger. And with that, you have a great evening.